The morning of August 7th, 1943, rose blazing hot over Guadalcanal. Staff Sergeant Robert Chen of the Quartermaster Corps stood inside what should have been a warehouse, but instead looked like an open-air graveyard of American plenty. All around him, piled high under the harsh equatorial sun, without a hint of shelter, lay tens of thousands of tin cans. They had traveled 6,000 miles from California canneries, survived waters prowled by submarines, and reached this forward supply dump in the Solomon Islands intact. And now, they were ruined. The tropical heat had eaten through the tin, split the seams, and spoiled everything inside. Chen lifted one can. Its label had melted into mush. He couldn't tell if it had once held peaches or pork, and it didn't matter. The odor rising from it told him all he needed to know. 50 yards away, soldiers of the 1st Marine Division lined up for their midday meal. Each man handed a single K ration that would leave him hungry. They could see the mountains of canned goods. They could smell the decay. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you're watching today. This wasn't some rare accident. It wasn't caused by the enemy. It was the cold arithmetic of American logistics colliding with the brutal reality of the Pacific theater. And it was unfolding on a scale that threatened the entire island-hopping campaign. At supply dumps across New Caledonia, in the New Hebrides, and throughout the Solomon Islands chain, American food was rotting faster than American soldiers could consume it. Some observers at the time estimated that 40% of all rations sent to the Southwest Pacific spoiled before reaching a single mess kit. 40%, not sunk by submarines, not shattered by Japanese artillery, simply wasted. In late 1943, a quartermaster officer inspecting a dump in New Caledonia reported seeing what amounted to whole priceless cargo ship loads ruined, including more than 100,000 cans of spoiled goods in one location. The United States was sending more food across the Pacific than any nation had ever attempted in the history of warfare, and nearly half of it was being thrown away. The men who witnessed this waste understood its cruelty in ways statistics could never express. They had watched friends grow weaker from malnutrition. They had seen tropical diseases tighten their grip on bodies already drained by poor rations. And they knew that back home, American families were rationing every bite, counting red stamps for meat, blue stamps for canned goods, making every ounce matter. And here, in the forward areas where that sacrifice was meant to matter most, American food lay rotting in massive, reeking heaps. The irony was nearly impossible to bear. The nation with the greatest industrial power on the planet, the breadbasket feeding not only its own military, but much of the Allied effort, could not keep its soldiers fed in the Pacific. Not because food was scarce, but because waste was everywhere. To understand how this disaster unfolded, one first had to grasp what the Pacific War demanded of American logistics. The Quartermaster Corps had learned its craft supplying armies in Europe during the First World War. That experience taught them how to move immense quantities of material across the Atlantic. The trip from New York to Liverpool took 55 to 60 days. Supply lines stretched about 3,000 miles. Warehouses in Britain and France sheltered stored goods. Roads, railways, and ports, though damaged, still existed. The Pacific was a completely different ordeal. From San Francisco to Brisbane, where most Southwest Pacific supplies were funneled, the distance was 6,200 miles. The voyage took not 2 months, but 4 to 5. Moving supplies from point to point within the theater could stretch travel to 8,000 miles. And at the end of those journeys, there were no warehouses, no roads, no ports in any practical sense. There were coral beaches, thick jungle, and forward supply dumps made from whatever materials could be scavenged locally or thrown together from tarpaulins. The supply system operated on a principle of sheer abundance. In the frantic aftermath of Pearl Harbor, as the military grew at a speed never seen before, the solution was to shove supplies forward without waiting for formal requests. Better too much than too little. On paper, the logic made sense. Supplies took months to cross the Pacific. If units in the forward areas had to request materials and wait for them to arrive, they would go hungry long before help came. So the Quartermaster Corps shipped everything in quantities meant to be more than enough. The mathematics supported the plan. Each soldier required roughly 6 to 4 pounds of rations and consumables daily. Multiply that by the number of men, account for the immense distances, and send the shipments. But the numbers didn't consider what happened once the supplies actually arrived. The food was canned. Tin cans formed the backbone of American field rations in the Pacific. Canned meat, canned vegetables, canned fruit. The sea ration that formed the backbone of combat feeding consisted of 12-ounce cans, 6 issued per man per day. The D-ration emergency chocolate came sealed in tins. Even the K-ration, meant to be lightweight, included small canned items. Tin seemed perfect for the job. It withstood temperature swings during long ocean voyages. It protected food from contamination, and American industry could mass produce it on the scale the war demanded. But tin had one fatal weakness. It could not survive long exposure to the brutal tropical environment of the Pacific. The heat was merciless, often soaring past 100 degrees Fahrenheit in supply dumps with no shade. The humidity hovered near saturation. Salt spray from the ocean ate into metal, and time, measured in the months it took for supplies to travel from California, sit in storage, and await distribution, gave all these forces room to work. The cans began to fail. Rust crept along the seams. Protective lacquer coatings broke down under the constant assault of heat and moisture. Cans were punctured during the rough handling of wartime logistics, tossed into cargo holds, dropped onto beaches in amphibious landings, or pushed off trucks onto crude jungle roads. Once a can's seal was compromised, the contents spoiled fast in the tropical heat. And because labels were printed on paper, they dissolved or rubbed away, leaving quartermasters unable to tell what was inside damaged cans, even when the containers themselves looked usable. The result was waste on a staggering scale. In some forward areas, supply officers reported cycles that swung between feast and famine. A massive shipment would arrive, more food than local units could ever consume before spoilage set in. For a time, men ate well. Then, as the cans deteriorated faster than they could be distributed, rations shrank. Eventually, another shipment would show up, and the cycle began again. The system was producing plenty and scarcity at the same time. This was the crisis facing the Quartermaster Corps in the summer and fall of 1943. The island-hopping campaign was speeding up. More men were being pushed forward, distances were increasing, and the waste was becoming a strategic threat. If 40% of rations were being lost, the supply chain had to carry 40% more than needed, taking up precious shipping space desperately required for ammunition, fuel, and other critical materials. It meant longer voyages, more ships exposed to submarine attack, and more strain on port facilities already stretched to their limits. The neat mathematics of abundance had collided with the unforgiving reality of tropical warfare, and something had to change. The question before the Corps was not whether to act, but what could possibly be done to rescue a system collapsing under the weight of its own success. The belief structure that created this crisis wasn't born from incompetence. It came from hard-won lessons and from the specific geography of 20th century American power. To understand why tens of thousands of tons of food were decaying on Pacific beaches in 1943, one had to understand what the United States Army had learned about feeding soldiers in the previous war, and what it had failed to grasp about the limits of that knowledge. The modern American military supply system traced its roots to the mobilization for the First World War. When the United States entered that conflict in April 1917, the Army had roughly 130,000 men. Within 18 months, it would swell to more than 4 million. This explosive growth brought immediate logistical problems. The Quartermaster Corps, responsible for feeding this enormous force, had to industrialize military subsistence almost overnight. They turned to the American food industry, which was itself undergoing rapid transformation. The early 20th century had seen remarkable breakthroughs in food preservation. Canning technology had matured, refrigeration was spreading. The emerging science of nutrition allowed planners to calculate caloric and vitamin needs with accuracy never before possible. The Quartermaster Corps embraced these developments and built a supply system founded on industrial abundance and scientific management. The lessons seemed obvious. Large-scale canning worked, mass production could meet military demand, and food should be pushed forward aggressively because the cost of a shortage far outweighed the cost of surplus. These ideas were formalized in Army regulations and became the backbone of interwar planning. When the Second World War began, the Quartermaster Corps scaled up the same strategy. They contracted with American canneries to produce rations in even greater quantities. They calculated needs by multiplying the number of men by daily caloric requirements. They maintained a push system, sending supplies forward without waiting for official requests. The model had succeeded in World War I, delivering goods 3,000 miles across the Atlantic to France. It should succeed again. But the Pacific War was not the Western Front. The geography alone created challenges with no precedent in American military history. The Pacific Theater was not a theater in any traditional sense. It was an ocean spanning 64 million square miles, scattered with thousands of islands, most lacking any infrastructure whatsoever. The distance from West Coast supply bases to forward positions in the Southwest Pacific was more than double the distance across the Atlantic. And once supplies reached the theater, they encountered yet another challenge. In Europe, even in the middle of war, there were warehouses. There were roads linking depots to frontline units. There were buildings, rail networks, functioning ports. In the Pacific, beyond a few major bases in Australia, New Zealand, and Hawaii, there was nothing. Supply dumps were planted on islands that had been untouched jungle only days or weeks before. Warehouses were nothing more than tarpaulins stretched over poles, what quartermasters called palm oases, or crude shelters built from local materials, often modeled on native thatched structures. These offered barely any protection from the elements. The environmental conditions exceeded anything the Quartermaster Corps had ever planned for. Temperatures and humidity levels that would have been considered extreme in the continental United States were normal in the South Pacific. Rain came down in torrents, sunlight was brutal, insects were relentless, chewing through wooden crates and cardboard packaging. Salt air ate into metal. Mold and mildew grew on nearly everything, and time, the implacable enemy of preserved food, had more opportunity to do damage here than it ever had in Europe. Because the supply lines were so long, rations spent months in transit before ever reaching forward areas. Once they arrived, they might sit for more weeks or even months before being issued to combat units. This prolonged exposure gave the tropical environment ample time to weaken packaging, break seals, and ruin contents. Canning technology that had seemed rock solid was, in reality, designed for temperate climates and shorter logistical chains. The tin cans used for sea rations and other field rations had been built to domestic commercial standards. They performed well enough in U.S. warehouses or in the mild climate of Western Europe. But they failed in the Pacific. The issue wasn't the food inside the cans, which was properly processed and sealed. The issue was that the cans themselves couldn't survive prolonged tropical conditions. The lacquer coating meant to protect the tin from rust wasn't formulated for intense heat and humidity. The seams where the metal components met became weak points, letting corrosion start its work. Once water or air breached a can, spoilage followed quickly in the tropical heat. Packaging made the problem even worse. Cans were shipped in wooden crates or cardboard boxes, fine for domestic transport or for Europe's shorter, more forgiving supply lines. But in the Pacific, wood absorbed moisture and warped. Cardboard turned to pulp in the humidity. Labels printed on paper disintegrated or rubbed away entirely, leaving quartermasters unable to identify what was inside. Even when the cans themselves survived intact, the outer packaging often failed, leaving supplies exposed to sun, rain, insects, and salt air. The rough handling that came with combat operations only sped up this deterioration. Supplies were loaded and unloaded again and again during their long journey across the Pacific. They were dropped into cargo holds without any real care. During amphibious landings, crates were pushed off landing craft onto beaches. On improvised jungle roads, trucks with almost no suspension jolted and bounced violently. Every impact became a chance for packaging to collapse, for cans to rupture, for seals to break. The belief driving this system, the conviction that sheer abundance would overcome every obstacle, was a product of American industrial might. The United States could manufacture staggering quantities of canned rations. It had the shipping to move them across oceans. The assumption was simple: push enough supplies forward, and at least some usable portion would reach the soldiers who needed them. This was economics masquerading as logistics. It treated waste as an acceptable cost to guarantee frontline troops never suffered shortage. But the waste in the Pacific far surpassed what the system could tolerate. When 40% of all rations were spoiling, the supply chain had to move 67% more food than soldiers actually ate. That extra burden fell entirely on shipping, a resource that was finite, precious, and already overstretched. Every ship required to carry additional rations to compensate for spoilage. Was a ship that could not carry ammunition, fuel, medical gear, vehicles, or repair parts. The human cost of this waste was immediate and painfully visible in the forward areas. Soldiers saw mountains of rotting food while they themselves ate K rations that left them constantly hungry. Their bodies weakened from insufficient nutrition, even though warehouses worth of food lay spoiled nearby. The K ration, originally designed as a short-term assault ration for airborne troops, was being issued for weeks or even months simply because it was small, portable, and easy to ship, but it only provided about 2,800 calories per day. Barely enough for men fighting, marching, and hauling equipment in brutal tropical heat. Its waxed cardboard packaging held up better than the tin of the C ration, but the ration itself was nutritionally inadequate for long-term use. Men forced onto extended K-ration diets, such as Merrill's Marauders or the British Chindits in Burma, suffered extreme weight loss, an average of 35 pounds per man over several months. Vitamin deficiencies such as pellagra and beriberi began appearing, diseases that were entirely preventable. They were not the result of true scarcity, but of a supply system unable to bridge the gap between abundance at the source and adequate nutrition at the front. The doctrine that had seemed flawless on paper was collapsing in practice. The Quartermaster Corps had calculated requirements with scientific precision. They had mobilized American industry at a scale the world had never seen. They had built a push-forward system designed to guarantee that no soldier went hungry. Yet in the Pacific, the entire structure was buckling because the distances, the climate, and the terrain all exceeded the system's design limits. This level of waste wasn't a minor inefficiency. It was a fundamental mismatch between how the system was built and the realities of the Pacific War. Fixing it would require more than tweaks. It required a redesign at the core. And the question looming over the island-hopping campaign was whether that redesign could be done quickly enough to keep pace with the accelerating advance across the Pacific. The responsibility fell to the Quartermaster Subsistence Research and Development Laboratory in Chicago. Founded in 1936, it had been the birthplace of the C ration, the K ration, and the D ration emergency chocolate bar. Its staff included chemists, nutritionists, bacteriologists, and food technologists drawn from universities and the commercial food industry. By late 1943, these specialists faced a crisis that threatened to undermine everything they had built. The rations themselves were nutritionally sound and could be mass-produced with ease, but they simply could not survive the journey to the men who needed them. Field reports arriving from quartermaster officers across the Pacific painted a grim and consistent picture. New Caledonia, summer 1943. Inspectors discovered more than 100,000 cans of spoiled food in a single dump. Many had rotted through at the seams. The stench was overwhelming. Solomon Islands. Entire shiploads of C rations were condemned upon arrival because the wooden crates had disintegrated during the ocean voyage, exposing cans to salt spray and violent handling. Guadalcanal and New Georgia. Quartermasters reported that they could no longer identify the contents of cans. The paper labels had simply dissolved in the heat and humidity. Without labels, rations could not be distributed or inventoried, so they sat unusable until they spoiled and were dumped into pits or buried. The statistics confirmed what the stories suggested. Food losses in the Southwest Pacific had risen to between 30% and 40% of everything shipped, and the war was only intensifying. This figure represented more than just the value of the wasted food. It reflected the compounded cost of shipping supplies thousands of miles across the ocean, the strain on port facilities to handle them, and the labor needed to move goods from ships to dumps to disposal sites. The military was running a supply system in which nearly half of everything produced was being lost. The laboratory staff recognized that this was unsustainable. The island-hopping campaign was picking up pace. Plans for 1944 included major operations in the Marshall Islands, the Marianas, and eventually the Philippines. Each new advance would stretch supply lines farther from their sources. If waste continued at current rates, logistics could collapse under their own weight. The technical challenge was immense. The laboratory had to design packaging that could survive months of tropical heat, humidity, salt spray, and rough handling while remaining economically viable for mass production. Commercial packaging standards were wholly inadequate. The tin cans used for sea rations were designed for peacetime commerce, where goods traveled from factory to store to consumer in weeks and were stored in climate-controlled conditions. Pacific rations faced a completely different reality. 4 to 5 months at sea in ship holds, open-air storage in dumps where temperatures exceeded 100°F, and humidity neared saturation, exposure to salt spray during amphibious landings, and constant jolts and vibrations over primitive roads. Any packaging failure would doom even the most carefully formulated ration. The laboratory partnered with private manufacturers to develop stronger, more resilient materials. The breakthrough came with what became known as the V-Box. Traditional wooden crates were heavy, absorbed moisture, and warped under tropical conditions. Cardboard boxes disintegrated in humidity. The V-Box used a combination of fiber and cellulose materials to provide strength while resisting moisture. The boxes were also treated with asphalt to further improve water resistance. They were not perfect, they didn't stack as efficiently as wood, and weren't entirely waterproof, but they were far more durable than existing solutions, easier to handle, and saved valuable space in the cramped cargo holds of transport ships. At the same time, parallel efforts focused on improving the cans themselves. The laboratory collaborated with tin manufacturers to create more resilient lacquer coatings capable of withstanding tropical conditions. They redesigned seam construction to minimize weak points where corrosion could take hold. Methods for marking cans were also improved so that identification could survive even when paper labels dissolved. The new cans featured embossed or stamped markings directly on the metal, ensuring quartermasters could identify contents despite environmental damage. Implementing these modifications required retooling production lines and retraining workers in canneries across the United States. All of this had to be done while maintaining output, because the military could not afford any interruption in the flow of rations to forces already engaged in combat across the Pacific. By mid-1944, the combination of improved packaging, revised distribution procedures, and field-expedient storage solutions began to yield measurable results. Waste rates in the Southwest Pacific dropped to approximately 13 to 14% by late 1944, down from the 40% observed a year earlier. This was a dramatic improvement, though it still meant that more than 1 in 8 cans spoiled before being consumed. Yet the 13% waste rate was comparable to the 9 to 12% seen in European operations, where conditions were far more favorable. The Pacific logistics system was approaching the practical limits of what could be achieved, given the distances and environmental challenges. The remaining waste came to be accepted as an unavoidable cost of operating at such extreme range under hostile conditions. The human impact of these improvements was immediate and tangible in forward areas. Units that had been trapped in cycles of feast and famine as massive shipments arrived only to spoil, now received more consistent supplies. Extended K-ration diets became less frequent as C rations became reliably available. Medical officers reported fewer cases of vitamin deficiency diseases and less severe weight loss among troops in combat zones. The psychological impact was as significant as the nutritional one. Soldiers could see that waste was declining, that the system was becoming more efficient, and that their sacrifices and those of families back home were translating into sustenance rather than rotting in dumps. This visible improvement reinforced confidence in the larger campaign as American forces pressed deeper into the Pacific through 1944 and into 1945. The reduction in waste from 40% to 13% was more than an accounting victory. It meant that the supply chain supporting American forces across the Pacific could sustain deeper operations, longer campaigns, and larger concentrations of troops than had been possible in 1943. The practical effect was an extension of the operational range of American forces by several hundred miles, according to quartermaster estimates. This was not because ships suddenly traveled farther or new ports appeared in the Central Pacific, but because shipping capacity, no longer burdened with compensating for massive waste, could now deliver effective supplies to troops operating at greater distances from their bases. The invasion of the Philippines in October 1944 illustrated the cumulative impact of these improvements, supplying over 200,000 troops across supply lines exceeding 6,000 miles from the U.S. West Coast, dwarfed any earlier effort in the Pacific Campaign. Quartermaster planners based their assumptions on waste rates of 13 to 15%, reflecting the improvements achieved over the previous year. Had they been forced to account for the 40% waste rates of 1943, the operation would have required far more shipping and longer preparation, potentially delaying the entire campaign. The advancements in packaging and distribution, seemingly technical minutiae in laboratory reports and field memoranda, translated directly into strategic capability. Lessons learned in the Pacific about packaging durability and rapid distribution shaped military logistics far beyond World War II. The recognition that supplies had to survive extended exposure to hostile environments without degradation drove post-war research into more resilient materials and preservation methods. Experiments with rapid distribution and minimized stockpiling in forward areas became foundational concepts in military logistics doctrine. The understanding that time itself constituted waste, that supplies sitting idle in dumps were at risk, regardless of packaging quality, influenced supply chain thinking in subsequent conflicts. The Korean War, fought in both tropical and Arctic conditions, benefited directly from the packaging innovations and distribution strategies developed in response to the Pacific waste crisis. The individual quartermasters who implemented these changes in forward areas largely remain anonymous. Their names are absent from histories of major battles. Staff Sergeant Robert Chen, standing in that supply dump on Guadalcanal in August 1943, was one of thousands of quartermaster personnel who faced the waste crisis daily and devised practical solutions under the harshest conditions. The thatched roof warehouses they built, the rapid distribution systems they improvised, the careful documentation of spoilage patterns they maintained. These were not celebrated achievements. They were simply part of the vast, unglamorous work required to keep an army fed across the largest ocean on Earth. Yet without these efforts, the celebrated victories of the island-hopping campaign would have been impossible. Armies march on their stomachs, and in the Pacific, it was the quartermasters who ensured those stomachs contained something more than hunger and frustration. The civilian side of the story carried its own costs and ironies. American families endured rationing throughout the war, carefully managing red stamps for meat and blue stamps for canned goods. They were told their sacrifices were necessary to feed troops overseas, and they were. But for much of 1943, a substantial portion of what they gave up was rotting in Pacific supply dumps, thousands of miles from the nearest combat soldier. The system demanded sacrifice from the home front, while simultaneously wasting the fruits of that sacrifice through logistical failure. When the improvements finally arrived and waste rates fell to manageable levels, there was no public announcement, no celebration. Families continued their rationing without knowing that the system had finally become efficient enough to turn their sacrifice into real sustenance for soldiers in the field. This invisible gap between sacrifice and effect was one of the quiet tragedies of the war. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, the American logistics system in the Pacific had evolved into perhaps the most sophisticated military supply operation ever mounted. Waste rates had stabilized at levels comparable to European operations despite far more challenging conditions. Innovations in packaging and distribution, developed in response to the crisis, were now standard practice. Forward supply dumps used improved shelters and rapid distribution procedures as a matter of course. The system could sustain operations across the entire span of the Pacific, from the U.S. West Coast to the shores of Japan, a distance that would have been unthinkable in 1943, when 40% of supplies spoiled before reaching soldiers in the Solomons. Staff Sergeant Robert Chen and the thousands of quartermasters like him returned home when the war ended. Their service was recognized with the same campaign ribbons awarded to all veterans of the Pacific Theater. but there were no specific decorations for solving the waste crisis. Their work had been too diffuse, too technical, too far removed from dramatic battlefield action to capture public attention. Yet without it, the battlefield victories that did capture public imagination would have been impossible. The marine assaults on Tarawa and Eniwetok, the army campaigns in New Guinea and Luzon, and the Navy's push across the Central Pacific all depended entirely on a logistics system capable of keeping hundreds of thousands of men fed across thousands of miles of ocean. In 1943, when that system was failing and wasting 40% of what it shipped, every operation was constrained by inefficiency. By 1944 and 1945, with waste reduced to only 13%, operations could proceed at the pace required for victory. The soldiers benefiting from the improved supply system rarely knew there had ever been a crisis or that it had been resolved. They received their rations, ate what they were given, and focused on the immediate demands of combat. Any improvement in the quality or consistency of their food over 1944 was likely attributed to luck or being assigned to better supplied units rather than to systematic advances in packaging and distribution. The invisibility of successful logistics is perhaps its defining trait. When it works, it vanishes from awareness. Only failure draws notice. The quartermasters who solved the Pacific waste crisis achieved the paradoxical success of making their achievement invisible. Viewed from the present day, the 1943 waste crisis offers lessons beyond military logistics. It shows that scarcity is not always solved by increasing production. Sometimes the problem lies in delivery rather than supply. It demonstrates that systems designed for one set of conditions can fail catastrophically under different circumstances, even when underlying principles appear sound. Adaptation requires not just technical innovation, but conceptual flexibility, the willingness to question foundational assumptions when evidence proves them inadequate. It also reveals that some of the most critical work in any large endeavor is unglamorous, technical, and easily overlooked, yet absolutely essential to overall success. The irony that opened this story remains its most powerful truth. American abundance nearly caused American starvation in the Pacific, not due to too little food, but because of too much waste. The richest nation on Earth, with the greatest industrial capacity ever assembled, could not keep its soldiers fed until it learned to stop wasting what it produced. The lesson extends far beyond warfare. Abundance without effective delivery is simply another form of scarcity, and production without distribution is waste. And waste, no matter how abundant the source, ultimately limits what can be achieved. The quartermasters of the Pacific learned this lesson the hard way, measured in tons of spoiled food and the weakened bodies of inadequately fed soldiers. Their adaptation, carried out under immense pressure and at great cost, made victory possible. That achievement deserves recognition, even if the men who accomplished it remain largely anonymous. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, explore the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.